President Harry Truman ordered the dropping of the atomic bombs over Japan on August 3, 1945. The first one would drop 3 days later on August 6th. This is perhaps the most monumental moment in recent history. It is all the more staggering when you consider that Harry Truman had only been the president since April 12th of that year. And at the time of his swearing-in ceremony, after the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he didn't even know the bombs existed. FDR famously, or perhaps infamously, left Truman in the dark about the Manhattan Project. Now, in defense of President Roosevelt, Truman had only been his vice president for 82 days, as he replaced Henry Wallace as vice president for FDR's fourth term. Rocked by this and hoping to never allow anyone to go into the presidency unprepared again, Truman established the still existing tradition to allow both major party candidates, once they were selected by their delegates and conventions, to begin receiving intelligence briefings leading up to the election, or the loser would stop receiving them after the winner is declared. The question then becomes, what would happen if a candidate ever took advantage of access to this intelligence? For almost 50 years, it had been speculated that Richard Nixon, former vice president and then Republican candidate for president, had gone behind the backs of the Johnson administration and sabotaged potential peace discussions that would have led to the end of the Vietnam War. A war that had raged for so long and killed so many Americans and civilians that LBJ, the man who just 4 years ago won the largest electoral victory in almost 2 decades, was now refusing to run again. How did Richard Nixon, a man who as a serviceman, congressman, senator, and vice president swore an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and the United States of America, supposedly sabotage these peace talks? Let's take a look. After the French, who were being backed by the United States, were defeated and subsequently exited from Indochina, Vietnam began an internal conflict between the communist North Vietnamese, which had allies in the South known as the Viet Cong, and the South Vietnamese who wanted a more Western-style government. The United States would become involved in 1961 during the term of JFK, and would join the war with combat deployments in 1965 and peaked at 500,000 personnel. By 1968, they had failed to make significant inroads, and due to this, President Lyndon Johnson announces a major cutback in bombings in March of 1968. Nixon declared, quote, "The pursuit of peace is too important for politics as usual." But due to his deceitful nature, independent voters did not trust his plan to end the war if he had one at all, which he did not. From September 29 to November 2nd, polls showing a gap of 15% between him and candidate Hubert Humphrey, the sitting vice president, narrowed to just 2%. Nixon wanted to get the inside info on the campaign. Nixon chose diplomat and World War II veteran Henry Kissinger, a man who would be both national security advisor for Nixon and Secretary of State for Gerald Ford, who for the first half of the year was helping with the inconsistent campaign of Nelson Rockefeller. Since Kissinger was likely to get an appointment from either the Nixon or Humphrey White Houses when he joined the Foreign Relations Policy team in September, he chose to stay behind the scenes. Kissinger wasn't particularly high on either candidate, calling Nixon, quote, unfit, and saying, quote, 6 days of the week I'm for Hubert, and on the 7th I think they're both awful. In September, Kissinger traveled to Paris to speak to the American delegation, where he was described as, quote, theoretical more than practical, and, quote, a man of integrity and decency, and that he, quote, doesn't understand the emergency in Asia. After returning from Paris, he called Nixon's campaign manager John Mitchell, where he explained Nixon should refrain from new ideas or proposals during the next week. Nixon would later say Kissinger did not discuss specifics from the trip, stating, quote, if he was privy to details of the negotiations, he did not reveal them to us. However, to warn me against making any statements that might be undercut by negotiations I was not aware of. Kissinger would have at least 2 more phone conversations with Mitchell. Kissinger would tell Nixon a bombing halt was coming and would be paired with flashy but not very substantive diplomatic movements in Paris. Nixon would get a similar description from Bryce Harlow, who was a member of the White House staff under Eisenhower and worked as an advisor for Nixon's campaign. He supposedly had a, quote, double agent working in the White House that was reporting on all the meetings, including who attended them, and gave the next moves to Nixon. This would be proven correct when on October 31st, Hanoi promised to halt bombings and give Saigon a seat at the peace talks, and the United States announced a total stoppage on air war over North Vietnam. This was viewed by Nixon's campaign as a last-ditch effort to give Humphrey, who to this point Johnson had been very unwilling to help, an electoral edge. Johnson most likely did not actually care who his successor was, as much as he cared about getting the credit for ending the war. The question becomes, did Kissinger do anything wrong in these communications with the Nixon campaign? According to William Bundy, who was Lyndon B. Johnson's Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, no. He would go on to say, quote, "Such action is open to harsh criticism only if it involves the use of inside government information. There simply was no useful inside information. Almost any experienced Hanoi watcher might come to the same conclusion." He would go on to say that while Kissinger, quote, "said or hinted that his advice was based on contacts with the Paris delegations, this sort of self-promotion, while attractive, is at worst a minor and not uncommon practice, quite different from getting and reporting real secrets." The question then becomes, did Nixon break any laws? He without hesitation put pressure on the South Vietnamese government on November 2nd, and it was generally agreed upon in both campaigns that peace talks were both dependent on Saigon's presence and that the results would affect the presidential election. Nixon had been urging Saigon not to participate since July of 1968. That month, Nixon and Mitchell would meet in Nixon's apartment in New York with the ambassador from South Vietnam, Boy Diem, and Anna Chennault, for whom this entire affair would be named, who was the co-chair for the Republican Women for Nixon and was the widow of China's World War II Flying Tigers General Claire Chennault. Nixon asked her to, quote, "be his channel to Mr. Thao via Boy Diem." She would talk to Mitchell from time to time and report Thao had no intention of peace talks before Nixon was elected president, Thao being the president of South Vietnam. Now let's take a moment to look at the life of Anna Chennault to fully understand the context of her involvement in this situation. The woman often referred to as either Little Flowers or Dragon Lady was a Chinese nationalist who fought against the mainland communist Chinese interest. This is why Nixon, the well-known anti-communist, was her favorite candidate and why she worked to fundraise for his campaign. According to the files of H.R. Haldeman, who would go on to be Nixon's chief of staff, in the weeks leading up to the November election, Chennault was in constant contact with the Nixon campaign. One campaign advisor alone, Nixon's and Mitchell's law partner Thomas Evans, had 8 contacts with Chennault from September 30th to October 31st, including an in-person meeting on October 25th. In that time, the FBI tracked her phone calls and visits to the South Vietnamese embassy. Quote, "The longer the situation continues, the more we are favored." Quote, Ambassador Diem reported to Saigon, quote, "I am still in contact with the Nixon entourage." Johnson found out that someone, quote, "very close to Nixon was encouraging," quote, "Saigon to be difficult." Johnson knew this revelation to the public would be earth-shattering, so he instructed the FBI to wiretap Chennault and keep her under surveillance. He would also instruct interceptions of messages from the South Vietnamese embassy in D.C. and Saigon. Ironically enough, Chennault lived in the Watergate apartments, and LBJ's National Security Advisor Walt Rostow warned Johnson, quote, "The risk of discovery is high." This could have been a useful message for Nixon and Mitchell in the future. They also wiretapped vice presidential candidate Spiro Agnew's chartered campaign plane, and through these sources confirmed that Nixon was indeed discouraging Thao from joining the peace conference. Chennault was discovered to have told the South Vietnamese ambassador, quote, "We are going to win. Tell your boss to hold on a while longer." Johnson and Hubert Humphrey, understandably furious at Richard Nixon, wrestled with whether to reveal this to the public or not. They ultimately came to the conclusion that since the way they obtained the information and its questionable legality would likely come to light, and the resulting scandal would make it impossible for either Nixon or Humphrey to govern in the event that either of them won, not to release it. On November 3rd, Richard Nixon and LBJ would speak on the phone, and their conversations would be recorded.
Mr. President?
Yes.
This is Dick Nixon.
Yes, Dick.
I just wanted you to know that I got a report from Everett Dershowitz regarding your call.
Dick.
I just want you to know I'm not trying to interfere with your conduct of it, but I'll do anything. Because anything...
Well, that's good, Dick.
We have to get this goddamn war up to date. And I also want you to know this. I've said this. I think the war apparently now is about where it could be brought to an end. And if we can get it done now, fine, that's what it ought to do. The quicker the better, and to hell with the political credit. I feel very, very strongly about this, and any rumblings around about somebody trying to sabotage the Saigon government's attitude, there certainly have absolutely no credibility as far as I'm concerned.
In 1997, Chennault revealed the truth about everything. Quote, "I was constantly in touch with Nixon and Mitchell." She also discussed this in her autobiography in the 1980s. Another question that has to be asked was, did these events have a significant effect on the election results? While Nixon did win 309 to 191 in the Electoral College, he only won the popular vote by 0.7%. And it is very likely this came down to the several million votes that were taken by George Wallace that otherwise would have went to Nixon and did in 1972. While it doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility that peace, or even the mention of it, could have helped Humphrey, it is far more likely his association with LBJ's unpopular policies and his constant undermining of him is what did him in the end. This was more of an indictment of the candidates than the parties they represented, as after the 1968 elections, the Democrats still controlled both houses of Congress with a 16-seat margin in the Senate and a 51-seat majority in the House. Now, it was ultimately inconclusive that Nixon was personally or directly involved, save for a few interviews from people involved and a few tapes from the White House, until in 2018, historian John A. Farrell, while researching a biography on Richard Nixon, made a discovery that would shake the foundation of American historiography. In interviews with South Vietnamese officials involved in the peace negotiations, they insist they did not attend the Paris talks because of political issues, not because of any request from the Nixon campaign. And this is likely true. While Nixon definitely coordinated to ensure a peace was not reached, he likely did not change what was to be the likely outcome anyway. In reality, Chennault did try to convince Thao not to attend the Paris peace talks, but she did so at the behest of Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek as well as Nixon. Moreover, Chennault did not use Boy Diem as her conduit. Instead, she relied on Thao's brother, Nguyen Van Khu, the South Vietnamese charge d'affaires in Taipei, as her main conduit. It is also very likely that Thao and his Asian allies may have tried to manipulate the United States election for their own benefit, which is the complete opposite of how many read the situation. Chiang Kai-shek speculated that Lyndon Johnson might abandon not only South Vietnam, but also Taiwan. Selfishly, Chiang wanted to see South Vietnam be victorious, and he tasked Chennault to relay these views to the leadership in Saigon. Cao had a long history as Thao's go-between with various constituencies in South Vietnam, and reportedly had helped to arrange a highly secret meeting in Vung Tau with Chennault and Thao. Chennault is believed to have passed along Chiang's advice to President Thao that Saigon not give in to the U.S.'s demands, and Chiang's hope that Nixon win the presidential election. Thao also had his own reasons to sabotage negotiations. In an interview after the war, Thao denied direct influence by Nixon. He stated that his refusal to attend the peace talks was due to the inability to arrange negotiations between Hanoi and Saigon, and to prevent the presence of the National Liberation Front at the talks. In an interview in June 1975, Boy Diem gave his thoughts on the subject, stating, quote, "The basic reason Saigon favored Nixon was due to Thao's belief that, quote, Nixon was firm against the communists, while Humphrey was wavering." Chennault received little reward from Nixon as a result of all this, as buzz around the incident and what Nixon deemed to be her, quote, flamboyant personality kept her out of the administration. She disagreed heavily with Nixon, who pursued a policy of détente with the communists, and this is highlighted by his trip to communist China, where he met with Mao Zedong in 1972. Nixon and Kissinger would reach their own peace accord with Hanoi in 1972, and Thao used similar tactics he used in 1968 to try and get a better deal. To try and force Thao's agreement, Nixon ordered B-52 bombers to attack North Vietnam in what came to be known as the Christmas bombings, and made a secret promise to Thao that the United States would come to Saigon's aid with, quote, full force if Hanoi violated the accord. Congress never backed up this statement, and in 1973, Nixon was unable to deliver. 2 years later, Saigon fell. By then, Nixon had resigned from office, the last casualty, as he told David Frost, of the war that he had prolonged. Thao fled his country ahead of the advancing North Vietnamese armies, and he died in exile in 2001. Chennault lived at Watergate for many years after. She kept the details of this incident to herself until the publication of her 1980 memoir, The Education of Anna. H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's campaign chief of staff and later his chief of staff for the White House, would be the only one to create the smoking gun, so to speak, that would connect Nixon to the Chennault affair. Haldeman was a meticulous note-taker and very often wrote down things Nixon would say or direct. Well, he would do this in October of 1968 when he would pen this note stating, quote, "Keep Anna Chennault working on South Vietnam." He wrote later that Nixon had also wanted Senator Everett Dirksen to call President Johnson and speak against the plan to halt the bombing. Quote, "Any other way to monkey wrench it?" Mr. Haldeman wrote, "Anything Richard Nixon can do." Nixon said Spiro T. Agnew, his vice presidential running mate, should contact the director of the CIA, Richard Helms, and threaten to replace him if he did not provide more inside information. Quote, "Go see Helms," Mr. Haldeman would write. Quote, "Tell him we want the truth, or he hasn't got the job." Luke A. Nitcher, a scholar at Texas A&M University, said he disagreed with the conclusions about Mr. Haldeman's notes. Quote, "Because sabotaging the 1968 peace efforts seems like a Nixon-like thing to do, we are willing to accept a very low bar of evidence on this." The evidence bar is quite high, in fact. John Farrell found the notes and papers that were made public by the Nixon Library in July 2007 after the Nixon estate, which spent years in court fighting to keep them private, gave them back. The story of how this came to be is quite fascinating. As mentioned earlier, Nixon lied to LBJ about the Chenault affair, and that wasn't the only lengths he was willing to go to in order to keep it hidden. He even had some surprising and perhaps unintended help from Johnson in hiding the truth. Nixon continued to deny any involvement throughout the years to biographers and interviewers, telling David Frost in 1977, quote, "I did nothing to undercut them," he said of the peace talks. Quote, "As far as Madame Chenault or any number of the other people, I did not authorize them and I had no knowledge of any contact with the South Vietnamese at that point, urging them not to, because I couldn't have done that in conscience." Hiding his documents was a key factor in Nixon's secrecy. At the end of Nixon's first term, Haldeman began to reorganize the system for keeping files and assembled a collection of the most important documents known as, quote, the White House Special Files. When Nixon resigned in 1974, aides to the new President Gerald Ford alerted him, Congress, and Watergate prosecutors that truckloads of Nixon's papers were being shipped to San Clemente. Ford ordered this to be stopped, which angered Nixon, and Congress enacted special legislation that seized the documents and the famous White House tapes. All previous presidents kept their documents and would decide where they went, either to family, presidential libraries, etc., at their discretion. Nixon contested the government seizure of his tapes and papers. He'd go to court, and his legal team scored victory after victory. After one favorable decision, aide Monica Crowley later reported that the elated former president sat down at the piano and banged out, "Happy days are here again." By the time of his death in 1994, he had succeeded in keeping all but a few reels of the White House tapes and tens of thousands of sensitive documents. The tapes trickled out since 1996, though around 700 of the 3,600 hours of conversations are still being processed today. Most of the touchy special files were opened to researchers in 1987, with the exception of 2 segments of records categorized as returned to Nixon or contested by the former president as containing personal or political material. Due to the exorbitant cost of storing all these documents, the privately funded Richard Nixon Foundation ultimately surrendered the returned and contested special files to the government. They were opened in 2007. They include Bob Haldeman's political files, where John Farrell found his notes from the 1968 campaign, and he didn't find these until 2018. Given the high number of people involved and aware of the situation, keeping it under wraps forever was a simple impossibility. Reporters, administration officials, and even Chenault and Boy Diem themselves wrote about the affair. A big break came in 1994 when the LBJ library opened the X envelope, which had tapes and reporters from 1968 about the election season and the surveillance of Chenault. Recently, the Nixon Presidential Library released an oral history and 2 long written reports by Nixon White House aide Tom Huston, who, under instructions from Haldeman, was to collect evidence on the situation for potential use against Johnson. In a February 25, 1970 memo, attached to an 11-page report, Huston warned Haldeman, quote, "The evidence in the case does not dispel the notion that we were somehow involved in the Chenault affair, and while release of this information would be most embarrassing to President Johnson, it would not be helpful to us either." Timothy Naftali, a former director of the Nixon Library, said the notes, quote, "remove the fig leaf of plausible deniability" of the former president's involvement. The episode would set the tone for the administration that would follow. Quote, "This covert action by the Nixon campaign," he said, "laid the groundwork for the skullduggery of his presidency." The Nixon Foundation website categorically denies that any of these events took place, and that all evidence is cherry-picked and inaccurate, despite that being an abject lie. Quote, "Although it is widely believed that Mr. Nixon and Mrs. Chenault acted in concert in dishonorability, there is no proof and only flawed evidence for that belief. It is based on a few inconclusive documents and suppositions made by journalists, politicians, scholars, and conspiracy theorists who are in many, if not most cases, Nixon critics." So what lessons can we take from this situation? The first obvious thought would be to withhold information from non-elected candidates, but then the incumbent party could in theory sway the tactics in favor of the next candidate, as they would have intelligence the challenging party would not have. We will never truly know what might have happened had these events not transpired, or how things would have changed for the better or worse had the affair been made public at any point either before or after the election. One thing is for sure, though, that no matter how deep you think you've gone in the rabbit hole of history and into the behavior of historic figures, you're only scratching the surface of the truth. And it just goes to show why you can and must never stop learning.